Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to the second part of the week where we're talking about diversity. Well done to all of you for finding many of these. And I think I see another one right there nestled in between temperature and this. We have Kosiwik, or Koziwik, depending on where you've been trained to say it. Here we go. Clear all the drawings. And let's go. This is a big story today. It tucks into what we talked about previously on 3700 when we were talking about diversity, global diversity, and how we might calculate that. Answering the question of what is a species and how many species are there, and coming nose to nose with the fact that these are two fundamental biological questions that any visitor to our planet would expect us to know, and we are very far from knowing. And we have estimates that vary not in an order of flavor, but in an orders of magnitude. And we talked about areas that are particularly replete with diversity, but also particularly vulnerable to changes in diversity that we are living through. And that's those changes in diversity that we're living through. That's kind of where we're going to pick this up. We're going to talk about decline. And we're going to talk about a specific case, insect decline, with literature that has exploded over the last 5 or 6 years. And we're going to place it in the context of this nominatively, presumably named epoch that we live in, this era that we live in, the Anthropocene. So that's where we're going to start. And where it's going to sit in terms of the learning outcomes for the courses, again, just as with Monday's discussion about the species problem and how many species are there and how we would go about calculating that, those are inherently invertebrate questions. And these questions about decline or catastrophes during the Anthropocene, these are inherently invertebrate questions too, because the diverse fauna of who share their planet with us, they are the invertebrates. And we're going to talk in our realm about the insects, the most diverse terrestrial group, the most diverse group globally. Now, to start, let's start with a temporal diagram here. So we've got on the x-axis, we have kind of chunks of time, 100 years ago, and you can see it's not increasing linearly to fit it kind of on this figure, but we have concentrate here on this gray wedge. This is our attempt amongst researchers to begin to define the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene potentially being having a Canadian link in terms of its definition. So there's the gray wedge. I'll make it kind of flash for you there. And we see above it the intriguingly named the Great Acceleration. And this is geologists attempting to find evidence in their sphere, literally in geology, that we can use to identify large changes in the history of our planet. And there's a small lake in Ontario called Lake Crawford that has been identified as a candidate for this spike here, with distinct sediment layers that reflect post-1950s industrialization, radiocarbon peaks associated with nuclear testing, and essentially the real acceleration of our effect as a single species upon the planet that we live. So the mid-20th century essentially being presumably the advent of the Anthropocene. Now, the effect of our species, it has been in no way is that a saltatory, like a stepwise jump or a jump. It's been a gradual change, and that's reflected in this kind of wedge-like shape, where the major kind of problems associated with the Anthropocene that have had profound impacts on the flora and the fauna across the world. This is a vertebrate graph, but I love it in terms of the number of species across the world that are experiencing decline, represented in numbers of individuals per 10,000 kilometers squared for mammals and birds. And you can see just the majority, the vast kind of intensity, particularly in South America and in the most diverse places in the world, that the color bar skews towards we've got a problem, that the big things on the planet, we're kind of focused on the little things, but the big things are clearly going through a decline, a negative effect. And so when we think about the advent, the genesis, or the start of the Anthropocene, this is an effect. And what are the horsemen of this potential apocalypse? What are the active agents? Well, there's a whole bunch of them, and it kind of depends on what realm, as we've jumped across marine, freshwater, and terrestrial realms in this course with alarming frequency. The role of each one of these horsemen of the apocalypse changes, but generally in the terrestrial environment, the habitat modification. So not positive modification. So degradation and destruction is essentially. So modification is, you can understand, as habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, habitat degradation. And this is associated with all of the decline that you saw evident in the last graph, which focused on the big things, the birds and the mammals, the things that we can use binoculars to see. What about the things that we're concerned with, the smellers and the tasters that weigh less than a gram, less than a centimeter long, and generally don't have a name and are unknown to us in most cases? Well, we have some indication, and today we're going to talk about some of these examples, about that they are also being experiencing decline in the Anthropocene. And there's pros and let's talk about a historic case first. This is a view of the grasshopper plagues that used to, in the 1800s, as colonization, kind of waves of colonization, swept across the existing societies of the Midwest and far west of North America. Those colonial settlers would experience hitherto unknown, these biblical plagues of grasshoppers that might appear. This is a quote from a writer in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, that they, in a newspaper from 1875, these grasshoppers might appear in the distance as shimmering clouds, blocking the sun as they came closer. And when they arrived, they would descend with the suddenness of a thunderstorm or blizzard, and they would consume all things. And this caused strife, hunger, starvation, crop loss, this was an enormous signature of colonial life, of settler life in our continent not that long ago. And this was due to one species. This outbreaking species was called the Rocky Mountain grasshopper. Now, the Rocky Mountain grasshopper tended to lay its eggs in ground that is seized upon and by those settling colonial settlers for agriculture. And it was the land that was immediately transformed from the prairie into, or fields into, agricultural, like tilled agricultural practices. And so from causing outbreaks and being numerous enough that they would block out the sun and could cover thousands of kilometers in that outbreak and could travel hundreds of kilometers in any particular day, within 2 decades, they were extinct. The last living Rocky Mountain grasshopper was collected in 1902, and we don't have a big set of collections of them existing in the natural history museums across our continent, largely because we tend not to collect the common things, because they're common, and space is at a premium in a collection, and so we don't want to waste that space with things that are common. This blocked out the sun, and in 2 decades it was extinct. So abundance of big or little thing does not always mean persistence. All right, there's Caramel's first appearance to remind me that as we transition from talking about the Anthropocene and about evident effects on vertebrates, and does this scale to the small things, and we have a historical taste of one particular species for which abundance has not meant persistence. Let's talk about these case studies that we're going to kind of consider together about the insect apocalypse. And like I said, this is a relatively novel literature that has arisen in the last 8 years and is still an active area of research today. But this was an article that was published in 2018 in the New Yorker magazine that had this great kind of infographic that proclaimed that the insect apocalypse was here. What does this mean for the rest of life on Earth? Where did the New Yorker come up with this? Well, it was because of papers that were appearing in the literature, and in particular, and so we're going to go through some of those chronologically as they appeared and as they've been dealt with by scientists and researchers who are concerned about insects, who are concerned about diversity and conservation. But this was kind of the first one. So Caspar Hallmann and colleagues in Germany, around this time of year in the fall, so 8 years ago, in 2017, in October, they published this study in PLOS One, where they evaluated the change in insect abundance across protected areas, German protected areas. And what they found, and they talked about a cataclysm, that since 1989, since the late 20th century, the annual average weight of flying insects caught in those traps declined by 76%. That's enormous, right? So we have cataclysm, we have apocalypse, and now we have the word Armageddon. So already in the literature and in the popular press reporting on the literature, you see terminology that's more associated with the biblical times than it is with the scientific literature. And there's the Guardian graphic that derived this kind of wanting, I think, infographic of the change that Hallman et al. Produced in PLOS One. The average grams per day collected between 1989 and 2018, declining by approximately 76%. Let's unpack Caspar Hallman and friends, their study. Now, these were malaise traps. The malaise trap is like a small tent that has white or clear fabric on the vertical, and then dark fabric on the top, and these alternating colors allow insects that are flying along to bump into it, and then to try to escape up, which is often the strategy for a flying insect. If they bump into an obstruction, they fly into a constriction, and at the base of that constriction, there's a single opening that leads into a jar, not of my water, but of collection ethanol. And so they fall into the ethanol, and at the end you have this big morass. And it's a really efficient collection method that catches lots of things. There's a lot of diversity that it doesn't catch, because no single collection method kind of retrieves all things. That's true for insects, it's true for crustaceans, it's true for all of life. But this gave them a continuous measure across decades in the protected areas of a variable, abiotically variable region in Europe over 27 years. And so they took all of those, and instead of trying to identify all the things because of, let's nod back to Monday and say that because of the taxonomic impediment, because there weren't enough taxonomists to identify two species, the diversity of thing that these traps were catching, they did an admittedly simple, but I think kind of elegant proxy, and they looked at abundance. So they just dried them and weighed them. So they're looking at abundance. And what they found, this is the figure from the paper, which I think is better than the figure in the Guardian, but these are the box plots across time that depict the distribution of the insect in grams per day, pool over all of the traps, over all of the protected areas, and what they found was this enormous change. 76 to 85% decline in flying insect biomass evident over that time. And because this is Europe, and because they're over that time, there are a lot of meteorological stations, they could correlate this observation with lots of other abiotic variables. And what you see here is correlates. So this is on the y-axis is a positive contribution above the above zero, or a negative contribution. So variables that are associated with positively associated with the decline or negatively associated with the decline. And so what they found was that there wasn't any one single thing that explained all of the change. In fact, the largest bar that they could come up with in their model was this broken one, the unknown. So the covariates for insect biomass included the strongest predictive one out of the suite of things that was required to explain it were landscape variables like the transition from forest to arable land, so cutting down forests and making not just kind of pastoral undergoing secondary succession fields, but actively working them for agriculture. Those were the two, and temperature associated with the climate crisis. Those were the two biggest predictive variables. So pollution associated with that transition to agriculture, fragmentation, isolation, and this was picked up immediately. This was, PLOS One is an open access journal, so reporters don't have to, or their institution doesn't have to subscribe to a journal to read it. Individuals can just go and read it. Individuals in your hometown or family members of yours that aren't interested or don't have the privilege as you do of studying this in a dedicated fashion, they can go and read studies in PLOS One because it's openly and freely available. And this spike here in the search, so this is the an index that others had published looking back on the effect of the Hallman paper, of Google queries that included the German word there that I'm not going to pronounce, that some of you will be able to, of insect die-off. And you can see that spike is coincident with the publication of the Hallman et al. Paper. And then the second spike is coincident with a referendum in Bavaria, in a part of Germany that had to that was asking questions of the importance of biodiversity to the people of Bavaria. So Caramel looks down on us, and so we've unpacked this kind of classic example, this paper in PLOS One by Caspar Hallman et al. That looked at a change within protected areas, and again a nod back to Monday when we were talking at the very end about protected areas and how they don't always protect the things that, I'm going to say this directly, but they don't protect often the things that they're not designed to protect. And we don't design them to protect the little things. And in this case, this is showing a catastrophic decline within protected areas. So another study that came out in 2018 was this study by Brad Lidster and colleagues. Brad is an American ecologist who had worked in Puerto Rico in the 1970s. And he was looking at questions of insect community ecology, but he had made collections about the abundance and diversity of insects in the forests, the rainforest that he worked in. And when he returned 35 years later with a Mexican colleague, Andres Garcia, to the same sites and used the same traps, he saw what they saw immediately was this change, that there were so few insects flying around. That quote is in blue. It's a link to an interview with Lidster that if this is interesting to you, you can go and listen to later on. So this is the mean biomass of the collections that they made, or that he made, back in the 70s, in 76 and 77, in the glory days of the Montreal Canadiens and Guy Lafleur. But if he goes back in the slim pickings for the Canadiens of the 2011, 12, and 13, that's the change that they documented in the mean biomass of flying insects. That it declined in some of their sites up to 60 times. There was a decline of at least 60 times. And they noted at the same time that one of the only other changes that was evident was a change in the forest, in the average temperature, in air temperature in the forest, that it had arisen approximately 2 degrees Celsius in the same period. So this was also a protected area. So this is an area where we couldn't invoke direct changes or direct loss of the forest. It was either an intensification or a loss of habitat around the forest, or the overarching effect might be something like the climate. So from Hallman and Brad Lister to these two gentlemen, Francesco and Chris, that produced a meta-analysis, a review on the worldwide, in response to the public, to the academic, the intellectual, and public response, like rampant, remember that spike in the Google searching, to these statements of catastrophic decline. They started to go through the literature to find less evidence studies, but studies nonetheless, that had looked at long-term insect surveys from the peer-reviewed literature. And what they found in their analysis was a high average rate of decline in insects. 40%, they said, of the insects world species could go extinct within decades, and 41% of insect species were declining, and the global numbers were falling by 2.5% a year. Those are big numbers and strong statements. 40% of the insect species could go extinct within within decades. That's a strong statement. Do they have the data? Did they have the data? What kind of data did they have to make such a suggestion? Well, what they looked at across terrestrial and aquatic species were from the published literature that had looked over at least a decade or longer at different collection methods and different kind of areas and different taxonomic groups. They looked at the proportion that were listed, or the proportion that were actively in decline based on the numbers that they saw. And what they saw was that the declines there, again, with different driving mechanisms. So terrestrial environments were largely the reasons that we had unpacked already, and the declines in the aquatic insects, the aquatic taxa, like the Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, Trichoptera, the EPT, the ones whose larval stage, the adults fly around in the air, but the larvae live in rivers and streams and ponds and lakes. Or the odonates, the same thing, but maybe the one that you're more you learned about earlier, like the dragonflies and damselflies. So this and that kind of 40%, two-thirds. This is a big statement, and this was picked up again and led to some of the catastrophic, calamitous words that were being used in the popular press to describe the insect apocalypse. So in 2019, late 2019, like nearly exactly 2 years after Kasper Hallman et al. Had published their study in PLOS ONE, another German ecologist, Sebastian Siepold, realized that this is his quote here: "We were sitting there reading it and saying, well, our time series isn't that long, but we have a nice sampling, so let's take a look." So again, in Germany, a smaller slice of time, 2008 to 2017, they examined changes evident in insect biomass, abundance, and diversity through time between 150, nearly the equivalent number of grassland sites or forest sites in Germany. And what they found, so grassland is here in the blue, the lower trend, and the forest is there in the red or the orange, the upper trend. What they found was that across grasslands, the number of species had been reduced by a third. So not 80%, not 60%, but a big chunk. While the overall biomass, so that was diversity, but the biomass has nosedived by 2/3. So that's roughly in line. That's approximately in line with the findings of Hallman et al. In the forests, the species number were also declining, with the biomass declining by about 41%. The drivers in the forest was not clear. It wasn't clearing of the forest. The forests exist. They didn't change their existence between 2008 and 2017 when this data was collected. So the mechanism of change behind this change wasn't clear. And in the grassland, for those species, what they found, or what they connected this to, was that the drivers associated with the decline were associated with the proportion of agricultural land in the landscape. So again, thinking about habitat modification when it takes the shape of habitat degradation and destruction and fragmentation. So Hallman to Lister to the meta-analysis to Siepold et al. Out in the landscape. And here's kind of the classic case from the tropics of Dan Jansen and Winnie Hallwachs and the parataxonomists of the Area de Conservación Guanacaste in Costa Rica, who have been working with and collecting in a standardized way over decades, since the early 1980s. Unprecedented work documenting the abundance and diversity of developing larval Lepidoptera caterpillars, the plants that they eat, and the parasitoids, the parasitic Hymenoptera or the parasitic Diptera, that eat those butterflies or moths. And these are incredible individuals. When I was an undergraduate, you had to specify which Jansen hypothesis. You had to be specific because there were multiple Jansen hypotheses in the index of my ecology or my evolution text. And I have had the privilege of working as friends and collaborators with these. So this is Dan and Winnie in their home in Costa Rica. This is us as a family with them visiting in the dry season. And this is Dan and I changing tires on my truck in Costa Rica when we had blown a tire. I love these two individuals. They're globally important individuals because of some of the trends that they've started. And one of the trends that they started, not on a directly insect diversity related or maybe in a surprising way, but a way that is sociologically inextricable from the diversity question, is that they have fostered and trained and mentored and worked with and created a standardized survey by highly skilled humans that live in, people from Guanacaste, from the Guanacaste province, who live in the park and then in the towns around the park. And they've trained them to essentially be biodiversity scientists over that time. And what you're tracking here in red is the number of parataxonomists that were employed by this rearing program over time. So from a couple of individuals in the early 80s to peaking and averaging out around 25 individuals. And what they found, and this is all of them here, what they found was that the number of individual caterpillars, the diversity and the abundance of caterpillars that this workforce, highly trained workforce, found, tracks how much they were looking for, how many people there were looking for them, as you might expect. If you increase the intensity of your search, you increase what you find. Until about 2005, when the number of caterpillars that they were finding began to decline precipitously. And this is important and kind of critical, because not just did the number of caterpillars declined, but the proportion of those caterpillars that were parasitized. So remember, we talked about diversity being this nested element, that host specificity matters to our understanding of diversity and our estimation of diversity. Each one of these caterpillar species, and we talked about some of the ACG examples on Monday, each one of them has a suite of parasitoids that prey on them either specific with some degree of host specificity. And what they found is that as the abundance of these caterpillars has declined, so has the proportion of those caterpillars that have been parasitized. So the diversity of the parasitoids and the caterpillars and the abundance of each of them has been in steep decline since 2005. And as an observation, that's the caterpillar rearing, but there are a collection of adults that have been done. Oh, that's Olivia. I just looked down and saw that. I'm interested. Which of Jensen's hypotheses did you talk about? Was it because he has some of the best named papers in the world, like How to Be a Fig, Why Mountains Are Higher in the Tropic, just amazing things. But anyway, this is a picture that Dan and Winnie took on the 27th of May, 1984, when they put out some lights to collect insects at the same lunar period. And you can just see, and I hope kind of understand, the diversity of things. So you see a lot of big moths there. That's the first thing my eye is drawn to. Those moths are kind of as big as your face. Mountain passes, that's my favorite. That has had a big effect on my career. So what they've compared here, I'm going to show you now, the same trap. Same lights, same individual lights, put in the same place in 2007 and 2019, at the same week in late May, corrected for the lunar cycle. And what you can see is this change in the abundance, change in the structure. You see a large abundance of small things here that might be hidden by the big things, but you see fewer big things. And here in 2019, you just see fewer things. This is a cataclysm. This is a dramatic change in moth density and species richness. And the bottom photo has come to represent the light trap catches that you make now in the dry season in the ACG. This is the standard. And this is for the young people of today, the Guanacostes people, the people of Costa Rica, the researchers from around the world. If you go there, this is now normal. And you need to be the 80 to 70-year-old people who have lived there or have worked there since the 20th century to understand that the normal of today isn't the normal that we had experienced before. Keep that thought, because we're going to come back to it again. Now, direct what might be causing this decline, this cataclysmic decline in moths and their parasitoids in the ACG. Well, certainly there were pesticide perturbations that happened in Costa Rica, but they were finished for decades before those, and they're outside of the ACG's boundaries. Now they can move, but generally those things have happened before any of those photographs and these kind of collection records were taken. And the forests of Costa Rica and the forests of Central America in general went through incredible cataclysms associated with colonial settlement and arrivals, but that was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So within the ACG in particular, this protected area, this is a national park, there's 100%, nearly 100% natural forest restoration. And the forests haven't experienced a decline since the 60s. And there's no pathogen that we could imagine that could have such a cross taxon that would work on all of Lepidoptera species. What's happened that could do that is pictured here. So this is looking towards the high elevation points. These are the mountains that are higher in the tropic. This is Volcan Orosi in the background. This is where I spend a lot of my time on Volcan Cacao in the near ground. And this is the kind of little collapsed, little bit of cloud cap cover that you see that has retreated up to the top, the very peaks of those mountains. And so the signature of the climate crisis in the tropics is occurring across elevation in the same way that we're experiencing it across latitude. And so what that means is the areas that dry temperatures and hot temperatures that were associated with the low elevation forests historically, and so big fluctuations in temperature, long periods without rain, hot days, not a lot of cooling off at night, those temperatures are moving upslope into the mid-elevation rainforest and into the high-elevation cloud forest as the cloud cover that used to characterize those and keep them at a nice kind of a refrigerated and wet temperature as it retreats. And so the temperature fluctuations that those mid-elevation and high-elevation forests are experiencing, they're experiencing an increasing frequency, an increasing variation, and an increasing average temperature. And so there's what Dan and Winnie wrote about is that there's no other generalized blanket mechanism across all of the ACG that could cause such a decline except for the abiotic changes associated with the climate crisis, temperature and precipitation. All right. Mountain passes. All right, now I want to know more about your paper, Olivia, but we'll put that aside. So let's unpack. So those are the case studies. Let's unpack some of the reception or the response to those. So this is Ed Young. If you don't read Ed Young wherever he's writing as a science writer, he's like a great science. He's a great science writer. And he wrote this statement: the claim that all insects will be annihilated within the century is absurd. And I agree. While individual species may be gone and abundance patterns can be changed, the idea that we would lose all insects, it's not going to happen. It's more likely that we would lose all humans. However, the fact that that claim is absurd, or a straw man you could call it, doesn't mean that the things aren't happening. So a lot of then insect researchers who had not been involved in the first studies began to speak in there. I'm going to speak occasionally in a voice of like a nerd from The Simpsons, but they just say, well, wait a second. Well, actually, these studies were not designed to test this. And they talked about, which is true, but let's put that aside for a second. They focused in on the fact that this is a limited number of studies, the Casper, the Hallman, the Lister, and they're restricted geographically. A big restriction, we haven't unpacked any of the American examples, but certainly to continental Europe. And they're restricted to taxonomically a subset of groups, particularly pollinators like bees, Lepidoptera, ground beetles, and they're biased in terms of sampling. And all of those things can flavor or, if you will, bias what we're seeing. So these forum, written by authors like Manu Sanders and Jasmine Jane, James Hanlon, Raphael, Eve, Lawrence Packer, all of these criticized actively the biases that the researchers of some of the earlier papers, particularly the meta-analysis, was that the quality of those papers was comparatively weak and didn't deserve the focus or the trumpet clarion call that 40% of all species will be extinct. And that's either due to misinterpretation or an overzealousness of the claims. And they focus a lot on the fact that the spotlight of insect decline or the insect apocalypse or insect Armageddon or insect catastrophe is a double-edged sword if the veracity of that decline doesn't stand up to close scrutiny. That seems like a reasonable statement. There have been many critics of these papers. This is a group of them of essentially climate. There's a lot of oil money behind these critics, let's just say. But many of them talked about the fact with the Lister paper that many other things. The Lister paper focused on a 2-degree change in the forest in the average temperature. But they focus on the fact that many other things had changed. They weren't able to incorporate analyses of tropical storms or the frequency of hurricanes or significant drought or exceptionally wet years or hundreds of landslides. And they talked, in criticizing the Sanchez and Bayo, the meta-analysis, they talked about biased search terms, that their terms were biased towards or designed to find examples of decline, not just monitoring. That they had geographic biases, that there was an incorrect estimation of extinction risks and rate, and that the assignment of drivers, remember that most things were this, most things were modifications, some things were temperature, some things were blah, blah, blah. It was really, they said qualitative, but they're meaning too simple and sometimes inaccurate and ignoring details that the original authors had included. So this is a look at of the biased geographic and taxonomic sampling that those authors call attention to in that large meta-analysis or the review. And you can see, first thing, even not understanding what the colors are on those bars, if you just understand that the studies take place roughly where the bars sit on this map of our world, you can see, yeah, this is not representative. It's a big deal to miss out on Africa and have one study from South America and one study from Central America. So this is a problem. This is a big problem. And then and this is a problem in ecology in general. We have a big latitudinal bias, an affluence bias, a way of helicopter scientists from the north who go to the south and come back without training, without leaving and including scientists of the south. And that's somewhat in this bias as well, that you don't see the long-term things because you can't do a long-term study if you're a helicopter scientist. You go and you collect things once and you publish them. So this is a criticism not just of the analyses, but I'm going to roll into it a criticism of often how science is done. All right, there's Caramel again. Now, as we move forward, out of the criticisms into some of the context that I'd like you to think about when you're introduced to these studies or these statements or these claims in the future. And some of them we talked about earlier, which was when we had the pictures of Jansen and Winnie's sheet collecting at night. In the 80s, densely covered. You couldn't see the sheet for the Lepidoptera. The change in taxa, meaning the small things in the early 2000s, the big things are gone, and then in the 2019 to now, all things are gone, and that's now the normal. Well, Dennis Pauly, this gentleman here, who at the time was a Canadian fisheries scientist, coined a term for this, which is I'm going to ask if you've heard it before, in just a yes or a no in the Y or an N in the chat. Have you heard of the shifting baseline? Because to be a diversity scientist, thank you. So a couple of no's, no's I'm seeing right off the bat. All right. So if you remember nothing else, remember shifting baseline. This is a context that's important to whatever taxon you work with, however you work with them going forward in the Anthropocene. And that is the fact that every generation of scientists or fishers or foresters or forestry scientists accepts as a baseline the abundance and diversity at the beginning of their career. And they use that, they entrain on that, they calibrate. It's a calibration point. The normal that you see is the normal that you learn as you finish your terminal degree or that as you take your first job. And changes are what you see from that. And when the next generation starts its career, it's recalibrated. The abundance has declined, the diversity has declined, but it's just the new baseline. So this is a big problem, and he was a fisheries scientist, and he wrote, and others wrote quite eloquently about, excuse me, how across the world, prior to collapse or through the collapse of various fish stocks, like the cod in the northern Atlantic, that as new generations of scientists, fishery scientists, and fishers themselves began to take ownership of boats and ownership of research programs, they would, if asked, what they would characterize as normal was what the previous generation would have called a problem. And this is important context to bring to our understanding of insect decline, to the role of potential drivers, and to whether or not to what degree we accept criticisms of the studies that have existed. So this is an interview with a diversity scientist, Eleanor Slade. And she says, when I work in the tropics, many species remain undescribed and their distributions and populations are unknown. So it is impossible to know if they have declined or they've increased. This, I'm going to say, is an emphasis. This is a classically trained scientist emphasizing type 1 error, which we'll unpack in a second. But what Jansen, who has been there, and Eleanor is about my age, right? They're a young person. They're not 80 plus year old like Jansen. But Jansen talks about the fact that in his experience and in the way that he interacts with the people of Costa Rica, he can go and have chats with aging gas station attendants who could list the insect taxa that have vanished since they had the same job at that gas station when they were teenagers. So I don't think that it's impossible to tell. You need to consult the people that live there and who've been there longer than you, and it doesn't. You need to consult the people that and integrate and collaborate and ask the people that live there longer. Now, another context that I want to bring in to the insect discussion is the fact that this quote that May Berenbaum, who's the head scientist of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. She's as eminent an entomologist as you get in the world. She's a wonderful person, and she wrote this statement in this book that was edited by a couple of Canadians in the mid or early 2000s. That you can, if you're interested, search for that PDF, and it's freely available online. Despite their almost ungraspably large numbers, insect species are at a disproportionately large risk of extinction. How can they make such a statement? So two figures, to kind of block out the bottom one here, but look at the number. So this is for different, so mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and insects. The number of species that have been evaluated by the, in the United States, these are US numbers, so it would be like the endangered species legislation. So a number of species evaluated is a percentage of the described species. So nearly all mammals and all birds have been described. Fewer and still behind the curve are the reptiles and the fish, but orders of magnitude even worse are the insects. So the number of species that have been evaluated, about which we know enough to complete a species at risk assessment. And then at the bottom, though, this is the ungrasped. So this speaks to, despite their ungraspably large numbers, their diversity. There's many, many insects right there. But down here, you can see that of those, the percentage of those species that were evaluated, so that small fraction, if you dive within it, what percentage were threatened or at risk, and it becomes the largest slice of the pie. So the species that we know the least about, what we do know for those small representative taxa that we know something, is that almost always they're at disproportionately large risk. And this is. I've crunched these numbers a few years ago for Canada. Same categories: mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and so. Black is the expected diversity. Yellow is the number of status reports that have been written. So a very small, but a proportionally small, as the same thing as you would see in the United States. A vanishingly small slice of the insect pie. Do we know enough about to evaluate? Now let's dive within that 0.11%. And what do we see? Well, so there's the status reports. This is the proportion that were endangered in any one of these categories. And that's what it looks like for the insects. So even in the same pattern that May Berenbaum called attention to, despite their ungraspably large numbers, they are at a disproportionately large risk of extinction. Now remember, to the Anthropocene that we talked about at our shared time together today, what's happening with all of the other vertebrate trends? Are any of them going up or are any of them going down? Not really. They're all declining. And so this is a group about which we know much less, and it seems to be declining. And the things that we do know about, they are at a greater risk of extinction. But the debate continues. You can still go into the literature. A paper came out. Actually, I was going to integrate it, but it came out yesterday, so it didn't get integrated. But the debate continues about whether this is a real signature or an actual problem. But my position that I'm going to present to you is that the debate dangerously could obscure the real dangers that they faced. And Matthew Forster, another insect ecologist, wrote about the fact that the apparent debate focuses on declines from a narrow range of monitored species, which loses sight of the vast masses of unmonitored insects due to land development or land use change. Jansen wrote about it and talks about it more elegantly to me. He talks about the fact that if your house is burning down, you don't need a thermometer. You need to call the fire department. You don't need a thermometer to tell the fire department how hot the flames are. And don't quibble with firefighters about the temperature. This is some of Jansen's perspective in his lifetime, not in Costa Rica, but in Minnesota where he grew up. This is his truck parked on a bridge where he was checking his beaver traps, and it had been left there for an hour, and strangely, he'd left his lights on, and this is the shoveling that he'd had to do of the mayflies that were attracted to those lights above that river in Minnesota in the 1950s. You can't find that now. There aren't places where you need shovels to get rid of the insects that are attracted to life. And so I'm going to wrap in these final couple of minutes here that in any other, this is a quote from Oscar Millman, who's written a book about insect decline that I'll try and right there. In any other walk of life, in the medical testing industry and aviation safety and school testing results, any horrendous trend, even ones that might not be global or that might be trends that like the 76% decline in Germany and within protected areas. This would be this in any other walk of life. This would be a call to arms. This and it would invoke what Florence Nightingale called, or what was amongst the first to call, this precautionary principle. It seems a strange principle, she wrote, to enunciate as the first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm. So a precautionary, one expression of a precautionary principle is that phrase, do no harm. So with insects, we keep waiting, Millman writes, as if for Godot, for the next study that can definitively say, yes, please feel free to understand that insect decline may be happening. Insect decline is happening. It may not be happening everywhere, but that doesn't change the fact that it is declining. And this gets me into some closer to where we're going to finish thinking about the consequences of error. We talked about, I mentioned type 1 and type 2 error before. You've taken statistics, you've taken biostats, you understand these kinds of things, and you understand that most scientists and most students were taught to think about alpha, right? Your p-value, that's what you were reporting when you were reporting your underseas, the diversity and alpha and beta diversity in the deep sea R study. You talked about the alpha, that it was greater or less than 0.05. This is associated with avoiding making a type 1 error or a false positive, right? This is you don't want to make the error of going out and saying, there's a decline, when in fact it's just a population that's going up and down. But there's this other kind of statistical error that is inherently tied up in the evaluation of the first, but which most of us are not taught or don't use as frequently as we should, and that's type 2 or beta, so the type 2 error, or a false negative, which is looking at the same trends, the same data, and saying, you are not declining because I can't get that p-value beneath 0.05. This is related to the power of a test. Statistical power is the probability that in this context, any given monitoring program will detect an effect if it actually exists. Power and type 2 error are linked directly by that very simple equation there. So we're taught to ask, well, how do you know that the observation isn't due to a natural variable that you haven't measured? And you can see that question inherent in some of the criticisms of the insect decline, particularly the early insect decline literature. But we also ought to be asking, how do you know that the absence of a statistically significant effect isn't due to the fact that small sample size, either space or time, or the natural variation in population, hasn't allowed us to look at the trend in a powerful way? And there's ways to do power analyses that play with the alpha that you're willing to accept to integrate the importance of this. But it takes an actively engaged mind to say we need to consider the role of type 2 error and the role of type 2 error in making a precautionary principle or in doing no harm. So bringing type 2 statistical error, Florence Nightingale and the precautionary principle to the table. So this is an infographic that you can look at your leisure, but the evidence for insect decline is substantial, but it's fragmented. That's just the way it is. And wishing that it were different doesn't let you rule out the observations that have been made. One of the common elements is that rare or specialized species are often suffering the most, and that they're more likely to be lost. And remember from Monday when we talked about this, as our estimations of specialization go up, so does our estimation of vulnerability. So, as Ed Yong said, insects will not be annihilated. But insects, as May Berenbaum taught us, are the least understood taxon that are disproportionately experiencing conditions that we consider to be endangered. So insect decline is real, is substantial, and likely more prevalent than we appreciate. And if you're interested in these kinds of things, in meeting some of the more players in the play, the Ecological Society of America had a symposium on this a couple of years ago, and all of the talks are recorded. So you can go see Lister and Hallman and Jansen talking about this. And there's 13 different talks that you could easily spend a quality 4.5 hours if you've got that time. Or you can get this in your library on campus, or for roughly $20 at any, go to the bookshelf and look it up there, or get them to order it for you. And so that's the time that we've had to talk about these things. What's coming up next? Monday's class, the last kind of content class, we're going to talk about emerging future questions that involve invertebrates, technological advances, those kinds of things. This week's case study, as always, is available from 9 a.m. on Thursday. You need to have selected your presentation topic tonight, and that's due a week from today. And then, of course, the final exam is coming, and those are the details that we've talked about before, but I'll leave it there for you to see as we end this recording anyhow. So I'm going to stop recording, but I'm going to hang around for any questions if you've got them. So take care of yourself, take care of others around you. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.